August 7, 1944. The morning light over Normandy was pale, filtered through a veil of smoke and dust. In a scarred field outside Mortain, something utterly improbable was about to happen. From behind a ridge, a column of Sherman tanks appeared, steel beasts rumbling forward. The earth trembled under their treads, and they were heading straight for a minefield, one that German engineers had declared impenetrable. For the German defenders, it was an image both surreal and terrifying. They stood frozen, binoculars pressed to eyes, mouths tightening in disbelief. Mines were the ultimate barrier, an unyielding shield designed to stop any advance. Yet here, before their eyes, the Shermans moved forward without hesitation. No detours, no hesitation, no catastrophic explosion, just a low rumble of armored determination. One German soldier later wrote in his journal, "We thought they would never dare, but they did, and the world changed in that moment." This was not just a breakthrough. It was an affront to expectation, a moment when steel challenged doctrine, and the Allies rewrote a small but vital chapter of the war in Normandy. By August 1944, the Normandy campaign was in full fury. Operation Overlord, the great D-Day invasion of June 6, had succeeded, but only at immense cost. The Allies were locked in grinding combat across bocage fields, hedgerows, and rivers. German resistance was fierce, bolstered by prepared defensive lines, entrenched positions, and, above all, minefields. Minefields were the backbone of German defense doctrine. They were not merely obstacles. They were psychological weapons. A soldier walking past a minefield was forced to calculate the risk of every step. For tank crews, they were deadly riddles written in steel. German commanders called them Stacheldraht Panzers, the armored barbed wire of war. For the Germans in Normandy, the minefield at Mortain was their last line before disaster. Maps marked it as Zone Alpha, a lethal expanse designed to channel Allied armor into kill zones. They believed it was impenetrable. They had planted it with thousands of mines, laid with methodical precision, covering several hundred meters. They had built it with the certainty of engineers, with the kind of confidence born from a doctrine that said defense was everything and offense was folly. Allied commanders knew the field. They had scouted it. They had debated it. But necessity often trumps caution. Operation Cobra, the planned breakout from Normandy, demanded speed and surprise. The Americans had to pierce German defenses, and time was running short. For tank crews, this meant confronting not just enemy fire, but engineering designed to stop them dead. By dawn, the field was a silent tomb. To the Germans, the arrangement was perfect. Every inch of ground in front of them was accounted for. Every potential path had been mined. It was a fortress without walls, a trap that needed no siege. Yet the Shermans approached it with a calm that seemed almost reckless. The approach began before the sun fully broke over the horizon. Radio chatter crackled, muffled by static. Boots crunched over gravel and churned earth. Tank commanders called orders sharply, their voices a mixture of focus and fatigue. They had heard the warnings. They knew what lay ahead, but they also knew that hesitation meant death, or at least failure. The Germans watched through their scopes. At first, it seemed routine, another armored advance. But then the lead Sherman entered the minefield without hesitation. There was no pause, no slow testing of the ground. The tracks crunched over the earth, sending small clouds of dust into the pale morning. There was no explosion, no fiery eruption, just a steady, grinding advance. A murmur rippled along the German lines. An officer adjusted his binoculars, brow furrowed. He muttered something under his breath, later recorded by a comrade as, "They must be mad or drunk." It was the kind of dry remark that soldiers make in moments of disbelief, a grim humor that belies fear. The second Sherman followed, then the third. One by one, tanks moved forward, their tracks chewing through the earth without triggering a mine. For the Germans, it was like watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion. Their minds searched for a mistake, a miscalculation, a failed reconnaissance, an error in the map. But there was none. The Shermans were simply crossing the minefield as though it did not exist. For a moment, the battlefield was silent, except for the rumble of engines. Somewhere, A machine gun rattled faintly. Somewhere else, a shell exploded in the distance. But here, at this crossing, there was nothing but forward movement and the sound of steel meeting earth. This was not brute force alone. It was preparation, technology, and daring. Sherman tanks, though not invincible, were a product of industrial resilience. They were designed for mass production and endurance, capable of taking hits and keeping going. In this moment, they became more than machines. They became symbols of determination. German records later showed that this minefield had stopped every other attempt to break through in the sector. Infantry assaults had ground to a halt. Reconnaissance teams had avoided crossing it. Anti-tank engineers had marked it as impassable. Yet here, in the hands of Sherman crews, it became a passage. The rules of war in that place and time had shifted. Some of the tank crews later recalled their own disbelief. "We knew it was dangerous," one wrote, "but we knew we couldn't stop. If we did, we'd lose the momentum. We had orders, and orders don't ask questions." Another crewman admitted years later, "I half expected the ground to blow up under me, but it didn't. We kept going, and somehow we made it." On the German side, the reaction was a mixture of disbelief and panic. Commanders rushed the radio, calling for reinforcements. Infantrymen shifted uneasily, checking their weapons. Engineers cursed their fate in low voices. For them, a minefield was not just steel and explosives. It was a promise of safety. That promise had been broken. It was in that moment that the balance shifted. The minefield, their greatest offensive asset, had become an open path. The Germans would later record this in their reports as a breach that could not be explained at the time. For them, it was not only a tactical loss, but a blow to morale. For the Allies, it was a vindication of boldness. The Sherman crews had crossed into history without a single catastrophic loss in that moment. The advance would soon ripple through the battlefield, forcing German commanders to reconsider their entire defensive posture. The breach at Mortain would become a subject of whispered discussion in mess halls and war rooms, a story that carried both awe and a tinge of disbelief. There was something almost poetic in that morning. A field of death, meticulously prepared, became a stage for an act of will. The steel beast rolled forward, carrying men who, in their own quiet way, defied expectation. The minefield had been the German statement of dominance, and the Sherman's crossing was the answer. Quiet, determined, unstoppable. And somewhere in that silence, before the roar of battle resumed, a soldier's voice murmured, "Well, that was unexpected." It was more than a moment of humor. It was a moment of transformation. The Germans had to see that their fortress was no longer impregnable. The Allies had to see that momentum could be seized, even in the face of deadly obstacles. And for the men in those tanks, it was the start of a chapter they would never forget, a chapter that would define the battle for Normandy in ways neither side could fully predict. By noon that day, the news of the breach was spreading along both lines. Commanders were recalculating. Soldiers were whispering. And the fields of Normandy, scarred and bloody, were forever changed by a moment that began with a strange sight. Sherman tanks rolling calmly, resolutely, straight through a minefield, and emerging on the other side without catastrophe. The calm before the storm had ended. What came next would test everything the Germans believed about defense, and everything the Allies believed about what was possible in war. They had crossed. The Sherman tanks, battered but unbowed, rolled steadily through a minefield the Germans had declared impassable. Dust hung in the air like a living thing, shimmering in the pale light. Somewhere behind them, orders crackled through the radio. Somewhere ahead, the earth itself seemed to tremble at what had just happened. For the German defenders at Mortain, it was not just a loss of ground. It was a rupture of certainty. Commanders gathered around maps in hurried consultation. Infantrymen scanned the horizon with tense expressions. Engineers who had laid those mines stared in disbelief. Somewhere, a radio operator repeated orders with an urgency that betrayed confusion. The minefield was supposed to be a final obstacle. It was not meant to be crossed. Yet it had been. And now the question hung in the air. What next? The answer came quickly. The Shermans pressed forward. What followed was not the slow crawl or cautious advance, but a surge. a deliberate push that transformed the breach into a rout. German artillery opened up, shells screaming overhead, ripping earth and metal apart. Anti-tank crews fired from dugouts and hedgerows, their rounds striking armor with dull thuds. But the Shermans moved as though wading through water, their momentum carrying them through chaos. A sergeant in one of the lead tanks later described it in words that still echo in surviving memoirs. "We just kept going. It wasn't bravery. It was habit. You train, you fight, you move. That's all there is to it." The breach became a funnel. German units scrambled to respond. Orders came down the chain. Regroup, counterattack, seal the breach. But by the time they moved, the Shermans were already pressing into their flank. For the Germans, the minefield was no longer a shield. It had become a gateway for destruction. In the weeks after the battle, historians pieced together what happened in those hours. Records show that the Sherman crews exploited a rare alignment of factors: speed, coordination, surprise. The field had been expected to stop the advance long enough for German reinforcements to arrive. Instead, those minutes of hesitation became an advantage for the Allies. German casualty reports for the day were stark. Infantry losses climbed sharply. Anti-tank crews were wiped out or forced to retreat. Tank crews reported at least 3 German battalions in disarray by midday. Allied commanders later tallied the breach as a decisive opening, one that allowed Operation Cobra to unfold with unprecedented momentum. For the men inside the Sherman tanks, the moment carried its own mixture of adrenaline and disbelief. One driver later wrote, "I could hear the shells screaming overhead. I could feel the ground shake. But in my mind, there was only the road ahead. I wasn't thinking about mines. I was thinking about orders." Another crewman added with a half-smile years later, "We joked that the minefield was just dirt. Maybe it was our lucky day. Maybe it was proof that the Germans hadn't accounted for stubbornness." The humor was thin armor against the reality of war. By noon, the German command at Mortain had shifted from disbelief to desperation. Communications were chaotic. Orders collided. Counterattacks were planned and canceled in quick succession. For many infantrymen, the breach became a symbol of failure, proof that their defensive line was not unbreakable. On the Allied side, the breach became a lesson in momentum. General Omar Bradley, reviewing reports later, would write that this moment, the crossing of the Mortain minefield, was one of those rare opportunities in war where boldness pays more than caution. His words became a reminder to tank crews across Normandy that the initiative was often the greatest weapon of all. By early afternoon, the scene on the battlefield was chaos. Sherman tanks advanced beyond the minefield, their engines rolling steadily across fields pockmarked with shell craters. Infantry followed, supported by artillery that hammered German positions. From a distance, German commanders watched the collapse of their flank, their eyes narrowing in disbelief. The minefield had been a final statement of strength. Now it lay behind them, silent, conquered. In letters home, some German soldiers tried to articulate what they had seen. One wrote, "They came through like an army of ghosts. We were ready for them, but we were not ready for what happened. It was not strength alone. It was something else, determination." Another noted bitterly, "It was as if the ground itself had turned against us." The Sherman crew spoke differently. For them, it was another battle, another challenge to be faced. Yet in their own way, they knew they had been part of something rare. Crossing that field became not just a tactical victory, but a story they carried for the rest of their lives. There was a moment later in the afternoon when the fighting slowed, and the battlefield seemed to hold its breath. The Sherman stood on the far side of the minefield, their metal hulks gleaming dully in the fading light. Smoke curled from distant gun positions. Somewhere, a lone German soldier raised his rifle and fired, but the battle had already shifted. For him, and for many others, the breach was the end of certainty. For the Allies, it was the beginning of a new phase. The breach allowed armored columns to pour forward into German rear positions. Roads once blocked were now open. The German defensive network was unraveling. The momentum of Operation Cobra carried the Allies forward faster than planners had dared hope. In later reports, German commanders described that afternoon with frustration and disbelief. They noted that the breach at Mortain had altered the battle in ways they had not anticipated. Minefields, once the ultimate defense, had failed to stop an armored push. It was a lesson that would echo through the war. Doctrine could be broken by determination, preparation, and yes, a certain stubbornness. For the tank crews, there were quieter reflections. Some spoke of exhaustion, the endless hours of noise and fear. Others spoke of pride. One driver recalled, "We were just doing our job." But there was something about that moment, the feel of driving over that field, the silence afterward. It stayed with you. You knew you had been part of something important. It was a moment that reshaped belief. For the Germans, the minefield was no longer an unquestioned barrier. For the Allies, boldness became a renewed part of their doctrine. For those who lived through it, the crossing of Morton's minefield became a memory etched in steel and dust. By nightfall, the battlefield was quiet in comparison to the chaos of the morning. The minefield lay behind both sides now, a silent reminder of the fragility of certainty in war. Somewhere, in the command posts and bivouacs, men wrote reports, filed letters, and whispered accounts of what they had seen. The crossing would enter military history as a small but striking moment of courage and calculation. It was not the largest battle of the war, but it carried its own weight. It was a reminder that war is never simply a contest of force. It is a test of will. In those hours at Mortain, the will of Sherman crews overcame the engineering might of an enemy prepared for defense. And in doing so, they shifted the tide in that corner of Normandy. For the Germans, it was a wound to pride. For the Allies, it was a cause for quiet celebration. For the men who drove those tanks, it was something between exhaustion and awe, a realization that they had stepped through something improbable and lived to tell the tale. One crewman wrote later, "I don't know if it was luck or skill. Maybe it was both. But we drove straight through a minefield, and we came out the other side. That's enough to remember." By the end of that day, the minefield was no longer a line in the sand. It was a story, a moment that would be told in mess halls, recorded in histories, and whispered in barracks. A moment when expectation gave way to reality, when a line of steel refused to be stopped. The calm before the storm was over. What remained was the sound of engines rolling forward, and the knowledge that war had changed, if only slightly, forever.